The chili was surprisingly good, a slow burn that radiated from the back of his throat and settled comfortably in his stomach. Russell Camden, disguised in a worn baseball cap and nondescript jacket, savored the anonymity. Downtown Cincinnati thrummed around him, a symphony of car horns, distant sirens, and the sizzle of Joe's curbside kitchen. He preferred the quiet hum of his server's back at the penthouse, the predictable logic of code unfolding on his screens. But sometimes the silence grew too loud, a constant reminder of the emptiness he carefully cultivated. He watched the afternoon crowd ebb and flow, each face a fleeting story he had no desire to decipher. A young couple bickered over a dropped ice cream cone. A businessman barked into his phone. A group of teenagers laughed raucously, their joy a foreign language he'd long forgotten. He idly wondered if he'd ever truly understood it. Connection, belonging, such frivolous concepts. He scooped up another spoonful of chili, the warmth a small comfort against the gnawing hollowness within. The world could spin on its axis without him. He designed his life that way, a fortress of solitude built on lines of code and guarded by layers of indifference. "Can I eat with you?" The voice, small and hesitant, startled him. He looked up, his carefully constructed wall of detachment momentarily crumbling. A girl, no older than 14, stood before him. Her eyes, wide and wary, darted around the crowded square, like a trapped bird searching for an escape route. Her clothes were too thin for the October chill, her hair matted, her face smudged with dirt. A pang of something unfamiliar, something akin to pity, pricked his conscience. He hesitated, the ingrained instinct to retreat warring with a flicker of what was it? Empathy? He hadn't felt that in years. It was an unwelcome guest, stirring the dust in the long-abandoned chambers of his heart. He looked away, back at his chili. "There are other tables," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. The girl shifted her weight, her thin frame trembling slightly. "They're all full," she whispered, her gaze fixed on his half-eaten meal. The hunger in her eyes was palpable, a raw, desperate need that resonated with a forgotten part of him. He remembered time, long ago, when hunger had been more than a physical sensation. It had been a constant companion, a gnawing fear that resided deep in his bones. He sighed, the carefully constructed fortress of his solitude beginning to crack. "Fine," he conceded, gesturing to the empty space on the bench. The word felt heavy, a commitment he hadn't intended to make. She sat beside him, her movements cautious, as if expecting a blow. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. He focused on his chili, trying to recapture the anonymity he'd so carefully cultivated. But the girl's presence was a disruption, a crack in his carefully constructed world. He could feel her eyes on him, hesitant yet intense. "What's your name?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated. He hadn't used his real name in years. "Russell," he replied, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "I'm Elena," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. She picked up a stray French fry from his tray, her fingers brushing his. The contact, brief and unexpected, sent a jolt of electricity through him. He flinched, pulling his hand back. He watched her eat, the ravenous hunger in her eyes slowly fading. He found himself wanting to ask her questions, to understand the story etched on her young face. Why was she alone? Where were her parents? The questions buzzed in his mind, an unwelcome swarm of concern. "Where do you live, Elena?" he asked, the words escaping before he could stop them. Her eyes clouded over, the flicker of hope extinguished. She looked down at her hands, her knuckles white as she clenched them in her lap. "Nowhere," she mumbled. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. He knew then, with a chilling certainty, that her story was one of shadows and secrets. He wanted to retract the question, to retreat back into his shell. But something held him back, a sense of responsibility, perhaps, or maybe just the lingering echo of his own forgotten pain. "Are you running away?" he asked, his voice gentle, a tone he hadn't used in years. A tear traced a clean path down her dirty cheek. She nodded, her silence more eloquent than any words. He saw the fear in her eyes, the raw, unfiltered terror of a hunted animal. And in that moment, the fortress of his solitude crumbled completely. He knew he couldn't leave her. Suddenly, a gruff voice cut through the afternoon hum. Elena. The girl flinched, her body tensing. Fear, sharp and visceral, radiated from her. A man, burly and menacing, strode towards them. His eyes, cold and hard, fixed on Elena. Russell recognized the look instantly. Possession. Control. The same look he'd seen in the mirror years ago, before he'd learned to bury his own demons beneath layers of code and indifference. He stood up, his body shielding Elena from the man's gaze. A protective instinct, primal and unexpected, surged through him. She's with me, he said, his voice calm but firm. The man stopped, his eyes narrowing. Who the hell are you? Russell met his gaze, unflinching. That's none of your concern, he replied, his voice laced with a steel he hadn't known he possessed. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a wad of cash. Here, he said, holding it out to the man. Leave her alone. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering between the money and Elena. Greed warred with anger in his face. Finally, he snatched the cash, his fingers brushing Russell's. He glared at Elena, a silent threat hanging in the air. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the afternoon crowd. Russell turned back to Elena, who stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that felt both foreign and familiar. You're safe now, he said, his voice soft, the words a promise he intended to keep. The afternoon sun, filtering through the gaps in the buildings, cast long shadows across the square. But for the first time in a long time, Russell Camden didn't feel the chill of the approaching darkness. He felt a flicker of warmth, a spark of hope ignited in the ashes of his solitude. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Fountain Square, painting the bronze Tyler Davidson fountain in a warm, almost melancholic light. Russell Camden, tucked away on a bench beneath a burgeoning oak, barely registered the picturesque scene. His gaze, unfocused, drifted across the bustling plaza, his thoughts miles away, tangled in the complex algorithms that occupied his days and often invaded his nights. He preferred this detached observation, this quiet anonymity amidst the city's pulse. It was a fragile peace, easily shattered. The slight shift in weight on the other end of the bench pulled Russell from his reverie. He turned his head slowly, a flicker of annoyance sparking within him. The girl was still there, the waif-like figure he'd noticed earlier, hovering near the food truck. Now, she sat beside him, a chasm of empty space separating them on the weathered wood. He hadn't heard her approach, a testament to how deeply he'd retreated into his own world. Her presence was a ripple in his carefully constructed stillness. He considered moving, reclaiming his solitude. Yet, something held him back, a strange inertia that seemed to glue him to the spot. The girl remained motionless, her thin frame hunched forward, her gaze fixed on the cobblestones at her feet. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant murmur of the city and the rhythmic splash of the fountain. Russell watched her peripherally, his analytical mind working overtime. He estimated her age to be no more than 14, perhaps even younger. Her clothes were worn, too large, hanging loosely on her slender frame. A faded backpack rested against her legs, its straps frayed and worn. There was a fragility about her, a vulnerability that tugged at something deep within him, a part of himself he usually kept tightly locked away. The aroma of grilling onions and peppers wafted from the nearby food truck, a sharp contrast to the faint metallic scent that clung to the girl. Russell realized he was hungry, his stomach rumbling softly in protest against his earlier indifference to the food truck woman's cheerful calls. He reached into his pocket, the cool metal of his wallet a familiar comfort. He'd buy something, anything, to break this uncomfortable silence, to create a buffer between them. Or perhaps a reason to leave. He stood, intending to head towards the truck, but hesitated, his gaze falling back on the girl. Her stillness was unsettling. It wasn't the stillness of peaceful contemplation, but the frozen stillness of fear of a creature caught in the headlights. He felt a pang of something akin to pity, a sensation he rarely experienced and even more rarely acknowledged. "You want something real to eat?" The words tumbled out before he could fully process them. He instantly regretted speaking, the intrusion into her silence feeling like a violation. The girl didn't answer. She didn't even look up. Russell shifted his weight, the silence pressing down on him again. He was about to turn away, to chalk it up to a misplaced impulse, when he heard a faint whisper, barely audible above the city's hum. "I'm not hungry." The lie was so transparent, so fragile, that it pierced through Russell's carefully constructed emotional barriers. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders hunched even further, as if trying to disappear into herself. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she was starving. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the dissonance between his desire for solitude and the undeniable pull of this girl's silent plea. He thought of his own isolated existence, the sterile comfort of his apartment, the predictable rhythm of his days. He thought of the food truck woman, her kind eyes, her casual mention of the lost children who frequented the square. He saw a reflection of their vulnerability in the girl beside him, a reflection that stirred something uncomfortable within him. He sat back down, the bench groaning softly beneath his weight. He pulled out his wallet again, extracting a $20 bill. He extended it towards the girl, but she didn't move. "Go get yourself something," he said, his voice gentler than he'd intended. "A burger, fries, whatever you want." The girl finally looked up, her eyes wide and wary, like a startled deer. They were a striking shade of hazel, flecked with green and gold, but dulled by a weariness that belied her age. She didn't reach for the money. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Why not?" Russell asked, his brow furrowing slightly. The girl hesitated, her gaze darting around the square as if searching for an escape route. She bit her lip, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that spoke volumes to Russell. He saw the fear in her eyes, the tightly coiled tension in her body. He knew, with a growing sense of dread, that her story was far more complicated than simple hunger. He'll be angry," she finally stammered, her voice choked with emotion. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Russell felt a cold, knot forming in his stomach. "Oh," he asked, his voice low and steady, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. The girl flinched, her eyes widening in fear. She shook her head, her body trembling slightly. She didn't need to say more. The unspoken answer hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud casting a shadow over the bright afternoon. At that moment, a gruff voice cut through the air, shattering the fragile peace. "Elena." The girl froze, her entire body rigid with terror. Russell turned his head, following her gaze. A man, tall and imposing, stood at the edge of the square, his face contorted in a mask of anger. His eyes, dark and menacing, were fixed on Elena, and Russell felt a surge of protective anger rise within him. This was the he she feared. The man strode towards them, his heavy boots echoing on the pavement. Elena shrank back against the bench, her eyes wide with panic. Russell stood, placing himself between the girl and the approaching figure. The detached observer was gone, replaced by a fierce protector, a role he hadn't anticipated, but one he embraced without hesitation. The confrontation he'd been subconsciously avoiding had arrived, and with it, a strange sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The algorithms and code that had consumed his life suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the raw, visceral fear in the girl's eyes. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across Fountain Square, the heart of Cincinnati pulsing with a steady rhythm of pedestrian traffic and distant car horns. Russell Camden remained perched on the park bench, the half-eaten gyro from the food truck lying forgotten beside him. The girl, no older than 14, hadn't moved from her spot a few feet away. He observed her surreptitiously, noticing the way her fingers fidgeted with the frayed hem of her oversized sweatshirt, the way her eyes darted nervously around the square. An uncomfortable knot tightened in his stomach. He'd initially offered her the other half of his euro out of a fleeting, almost involuntary sense of pity. Now, a prickle of unease told him there was more to her story than met the eye. He picked at the cooling meat, the spiced lamb suddenly tasteless. This was his routine, his sanctuary, an hour stolen from the sterile confines of his apartment and the demanding hum of his computer screens. He came here to be invisible, to lose himself in the anonymity of the crowd. Now, this girl, this waif with her haunted eyes, was disrupting the delicate balance of his carefully constructed solitude. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, the words escaping before he could censor them. He instantly regretted the intrusion, cursing his impulsive nature. She flinched, her gaze snapping to his. He saw a flicker of fear, quickly masked by a carefully constructed indifference. "No," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. The lie hung heavy in the air between them. He knew it, she knew it. The silence stretched, punctuated by the cheerful clang of a trolley bell and the sizzle of hot dogs from a nearby vendor. Russell's mind churned, a complex algorithm of social cues and probabilities running in the background. Her clothes were too big, her demeanor too guarded. The way she clutched a worn backpack to her chest, as if it held her entire world, spoke volumes. He recognized the signs, the subtle indicators of a life lived on the fringes. He'd seen them before, in the shadowed alleys and forgotten corners of the city, brief glimpses of brokenness he'd always meticulously avoided. He'd built his life around avoidance. Avoidance of emotional entanglement, avoidance of human connection, avoidance of the messy, unpredictable chaos of the real world. He'd found solace in the clean, logical world of code, where every problem had a solution, every input a predictable output. But this girl, with her silent plea radiating from her like a distress signal, was proving to be a glitch in his carefully constructed system. "Running from someone?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a fragile butterfly, its wings threatening to tear at the slightest breeze. Her eyes widened, a flicker of raw panic flashing across her face before she quickly composed herself. "You ask a lot of questions," she retorted, her voice laced with a defiance that didn't quite reach her eyes. He studied her, his analytical mind dissecting her every micro-expression. The defensive posture, the tight grip on her backpack, the rapid blinking all pointed to a deep-seated fear. He knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that this girl was running. And whatever she was running from was far more terrifying than any monster lurking in the shadows. He considered turning away, retreating back into the comfortable shell of his solitude. It'd be the easiest thing to do. He could simply offer her some money, a fleeting gesture of charity that would absolve him of any further responsibility. But something held him back, a nagging sense of obligation he couldn't quite ignore. He thought of the woman at the food truck, her weary eyes, her casual mention of the runaway kids who frequented the square. He dismissed it then, filed it away as another piece of irrelevant data. Now, it resonated with a chilling clarity. He took a deep breath, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs. "Look," he began, his voice softer now, stripped of its usual detached coolness. "I'm not going to pry. But if you need help, I can help." The words felt foreign on his tongue, clumsy and awkward. He wasn't used to offering help, wasn't used to engaging in this level of human interaction. He felt a strange mix of apprehension and something else, a flicker of something akin to concern. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on the cobblestones beneath her feet. He could almost hear the frantic whirring of her thoughts, the internal battle raging within her. He waited, giving her the space she needed to process his words. The silence stretched, filled only with the ambient sounds of the city. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting his. He saw a flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, like a newborn flame struggling against a harsh wind. And then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a wave of fear so intense it made him flinch. A rough hand clamped down on her shoulder, yanking her to her feet. "There you are," a gruff voice growled. A man, burly and menacing, loomed over her, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "Thought you could run away from me, did you?" Elena's eyes locked with Russell's, a silent plea for help echoing in their depths. The carefully constructed wall of indifference crumbled, revealing the terrified child beneath. Russell felt a surge of protective anger, a primal instinct he hadn't known he possessed. He stood up, his body tense, ready to confront the looming threat. His carefully constructed world of solitude shattered, replaced by the raw, unpredictable reality of the moment. The remnants of his lunch lay forgotten on the bench beside him, the spicy aroma of the chorizo burrito a stark contrast to the bitter taste rising in his throat. Russell Camden, a man accustomed to the sterile silence of code and the predictable logic of algorithms, found himself adrift in a sea of raw, untamed emotion. The girl, Elena, still huddled beside him, had become a paradox, a fragile bird with broken wings, yet possessing a strength that resonated deeper than any force he'd encountered in his carefully constructed world. He'd offered her food, a simple act of charity, a way to distance himself from the gnawing discomfort her presence evoked. Yet, the single tear, tracing a path through the grime on her cheek, had unraveled something within him, a tightly wound coil of empathy he thought long dormant. He'd asked her name, a perfunctory question, expecting a monosyllabic answer, a swift retreat back into the anonymity of the city. Instead, she'd offered him a glimpse into an abyss, a world of pain he could scarcely comprehend. Her voice, barely a whisper, cracked the silence that had settled between them. "My mom, she left me." The words hung in the air, fragile as dandelion seeds scattered by the wind. "Gone, gone, gone." Each repetition was a hammer blow against the invisible walls she'd erected around herself. Each gone, a testament to the gaping hole ripped through her young life. Russell's mind recoiled. Abandonment, a concept he'd only ever encountered in abstract terms, a statistical anomaly in the datasets he analyzed. He'd never witnessed its raw, visceral impact on a human being, let alone a child barely old enough to navigate the complexities of adolescence. He felt a strange urge to reach out, to offer some form of comfort, yet his hand remained frozen, suspended between his desire to help and the ingrained habit of emotional detachment. Elena continued, her voice gaining a brittle edge. "They took me to a place, a home." The word home dripped with irony, a bitter mockery of the sanctuary it was supposed to represent. He saw her shoulders tremble, the subtle tremor echoing the earthquake of emotions raging within her. He imagined the sterile walls of a government facility, the echoing footsteps in empty corridors, the pervasive scent of disinfectant masking a deeper, more insidious odor of neglect. "It wasn't a home," she whispered, the words barely audible above the distant drone of traffic. "It was a cage." Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, met his, and in that fleeting connection, he saw a lifetime of pain compressed into a single, searing gaze. He saw the flickering embers of defiance, the desperate yearning for escape, the chilling acceptance of a reality far too harsh for her tender years. He thought of his own childhood, the sterile perfection of his upbringing, the suffocating absence of genuine connection masked by material abundance. He'd always considered himself fortunate, privileged. Yet, in that moment, confronted with the raw vulnerability of this young girl, he felt a pang of something akin to envy. Envy for the fierce spirit that still flickered within her, the resilience forged in the crucible of suffering, the capacity for emotion he himself had long suppressed. "They moved me around," Elena continued, her voice a monotone, devoid of inflection, a chilling testament to the emotional numbness that had become her shield. "Different families, different rules, different smells." She shuddered. The memory of those smells, stale cigarette smoke, unwashed laundry, the cloying sweetness of cheap air freshener masking deeper, more unpleasant odors clinging to her like a second skin. He knew with a sickening certainty what those different rules entailed. The unspoken expectations, the veiled threats, the casual cruelty that masquerades as discipline. He'd read about it in reports, seen it depicted in documentaries, but the sanitized versions paled in comparison to the raw, visceral reality reflected in Elena's eyes. The last one, she hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. Hee. Her voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air, thick with the unspoken horrors they represented. Russell's mind raced, filling in the blanks with images he desperately wished he could erase. He felt a surge of anger, a primal urge to protect, to shield her from the darkness that threatened to consume her. "He hurt you," Russell stated, the words less a question than a confirmation of the unspoken truth. Elena flinched, her eyes darting away, seeking refuge in the bustling street scene, as if the anonymity of the crowd could offer some solace. She didn't answer, but the single tear that escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek, spoke volumes. It was a tear of pain, of fear, of resignation. But it was also a tear of defiance, a silent testament to the unyielding spirit that refused to be broken. Russell knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. The detached observer, the man who had meticulously constructed a life of solitude and emotional distance, was gone. In his place stood a protector, a guardian, driven by a force he hadn't realized he possessed. He had to help her. He had to shield her from the shadows that clung to her like a shroud. He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly above hers. He wanted to touch her, to offer a tangible symbol of comfort, but he sensed her fear, the instinctive recoil from any form of physical contact. He retracted his hand, settling for a gentle, reassuring nod. "Where is he now?" he asked, his voice low, steady, laced with a quiet strength that surprised even him. Elena's eyes widened, a flicker of fear momentarily eclipsing the dull resignation. She shook her head, her lips trembling. "I don't know." The lie was transparent, but he didn't press. He knew she was protecting herself, guarding the fragile sanctuary she'd carved out in the unforgiving landscape of the city. Just then, a figure emerged from the crowd, a hulking silhouette against the backdrop of the afternoon sun. A chill snaked down Russell's spine, a primal instinct warning him of impending danger. He recognized the man, the one who had bought Elena the hot dog, the one whose eyes held a predatory gleam. He felt Elena tense beside him, her body trembling like a trapped bird. The man approached, his gait confident, his eyes fixed on Elena, a possessive glint in their depths. Russell knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was the source of her fear, the embodiment of the darkness that haunted her dreams. The man stopped before them, his shadow falling over Elena like a shroud. "There you are," he said, his voice smooth, laced with a chilling undercurrent of menace. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The confrontation had begun. The remnants of the afternoon sun clung stubbornly to the brick walls of the alleyway, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the dust motes. The air, still thick with the day's heat, carried the faint, metallic tang of exhaust fumes and the distant, rhythmic thump of a bass drum leaking from a nearby club. Elena's small frame seemed to shrink further into the grimy brick wall, her eyes wide, fixed on the alley's entrance. A flicker of something primal, something hunted, crossed her face. Her hand, still clutching the remnants of the sandwich Russell had bought her, trembled almost imperceptibly. Just a car backfiring, she told herself, the words a silent mantra against the rising tide of fear. Just a car. But the tremor in her hand betrayed the lie. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small, choked sound lost in the city's hum. Russell, observing her sudden rigidity, felt a prickle of unease. He had seen that look before, not on a child, but on the faces of soldiers in war zones, a look that spoke of a deep-seated terror, a terror that lived just beneath the surface, always ready to erupt. He followed her gaze to the alley entrance, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual urban tableau, a street vendor hawking hot dogs, a couple arguing over a parking space, the ceaseless flow of traffic. She's jumpy, he thought, the observation clinical detached. Understandable, given her circumstances. He had gleaned enough from their fragmented conversation to understand that she was running from something or someone. Yet a part of him, a part he had long kept buried under layers of cynicism and emotional detachment, stirred. He shifted slightly, placing himself subtly between her and the alley entrance. A pointless gesture, perhaps, but it offered a semblance of protection, a shield against the unseen threat that had so clearly spooked her. "Don't say anything. Don't move," she whispered, the words barely audible above the city's din. Her voice, thin and reedy, sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't the command itself, but the raw, visceral fear behind it that unnerved him. He saw it in the way her pupils dilated, in the rapid rise and fall of her chest, in the way her small hand tightened into a fist. This wasn't the skittishness of a stray animal. This was the honed instinct of prey. He wanted to ask, to probe, to understand the source of this terror. But the urgency in her voice, the desperation in her eyes, silenced him. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her fear, a silent promise of his presence. He held his breath, listening, straining to hear what she had heard, to decipher the threat that had so completely consumed her. The city's noises, usually a comforting white noise, now seemed amplified, each clang, each shout, each rumble a potential harbinger of danger. The air in the alley crackled with a sudden tension, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Elena's eyes, already wide, seemed to widen further, her breath trapped in her lungs. A shadow fell across the alley entrance, long and menacing, stretching like a predatory hand. Russell's muscles tensed, his mind racing, calculating escape routes, assessing the potential threat. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was what she had been waiting for, dreading. This was the he she had alluded to in their fragmented conversation, the phantom that haunted her every waking moment. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man built like a bulldozer, his face obscured by the fading light. But even without seeing his features, Russell could sense the menace radiating off him, the palpable aura of violence. The man scanned the alley, his gaze lingering for a moment on a discarded newspaper, a stray cat slinking through the shadows, before finally landing on Elena. His lips curled into a cruel smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There you are," he said, his voice a low growl that echoed off the brick walls. It was a voice that held no warmth, no affection, only a chilling possessiveness. A wave of nausea washed over Russell. He knew that voice, that tone. He had heard it before, not directed at him, but at others, at those deemed weaker, those deemed vulnerable. It was the voice of power, of control, of unchecked aggression, the voice of a predator. He felt a surge of protective anger, an emotion so foreign, so unexpected, that it momentarily stunned him. He had built his life on logic, on detachment, on the careful avoidance of emotional entanglement. Yet here he was, standing in a grimy alleyway, ready to defend a teenage runaway from a man who clearly intended her harm. "She's not going anywhere with you," Russell said, the words surprising even himself. His voice, though calm, held a steeliness he hadn't known he possessed. The man turned, his gaze now fixed on Russell, a mixture of surprise and contempt in his eyes. "And who the hell are you?" he sneered, taking a step closer, his bulk filling the narrow alleyway. Russell stood his ground, his heart pounding against his ribs. He knew he was outmatched physically, but a strange calmness had settled over him, a calmness born not of fearlessness, but of a newfound clarity of purpose. He looked at Elena, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. In that moment, he knew he couldn't walk away. He couldn't abandon her to this man, to this darkness. This wasn't just about protecting her. It was about reclaiming a part of himself he thought he had lost, a part of himself that still believed in right and wrong, in good and evil. He took a deep breath, the alley's stale air filling his lungs, and prepared for the confrontation. The acrid scent of exhaust fumes still clung to the alley, a stark contrast to the lingering sweetness of the churros they'd shared. Elena's small hand, moments ago trembling in his, now clenched into a fist at her side. Russell watched her, the flickering neon sign of a nearby bar painting her face in alternating shades of crimson and shadow. He felt a strange disconnect, as if observing a play unfold from a distance, yet his heart pounded a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He hadn't felt this alive, this engaged in years. His carefully constructed world of code and algorithms felt miles away, replaced by the raw, pulsing reality of this girl's fear and the unsettling anticipation thrumming in the air. A shadow detached itself from the gloom at the alley's mouth, lengthening as it approached. Elena stiffened, her breath catching in a choked gasp. Russell's hand instinctively tightened around the phone in his pocket, the cool metal a small comfort against his suddenly clammy palm. He had already dialed 911, his finger hovering over the call button. He'd offered to call the police earlier, but Elena had vehemently refused. Now, seeing the terror etched on her face, he knew he had to act. The figure resolved itself into a man, tall and imposing, his features obscured by the dim light. He moved with a predatory grace that sent a shiver down Russell's spine. He recognized the man from the photo Elena had hesitantly shown him earlier, the man she called uncle, the man who was supposed to be her protector, her family. Russell's stomach twisted with a nauseating blend of anger and pity. Elena. The man's voice was a low growl, roughened at the edges. Russell noted how the girl flinched at the sound, her shoulders hunching defensively. Time to come home. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken menace. Russell wanted to step forward to shield her, but something held him back. He sensed this moment belonged to Elena. He watched, his breath held captive in his chest, as the girl slowly lifted her head, her gaze locking onto the approaching man. Her eyes, wide and dark, reflected the flickering neon lights, but Russell could see something else in their depths, something that hadn't been there before. A spark, a flicker of defiance. "No," she said, the word barely a whisper, yet it carried an unexpected weight in the stillness of the alley. Russell's heart clenched. He felt a strange surge of pride, irrational perhaps, but powerful nonetheless. The man stopped, his body tensing. "What did you say?" Elena took a small step forward, her chin tilted upwards. "I said no. I'm not going back." Russell's thumb pressed the call button, the quiet beep of the connection a counterpoint to the escalating tension. He held the phone discreetly to his ear, relaying the situation to the dispatcher in a low, calm voice. He divided his attention between the call and the unfolding scene before him, his mind racing, calculating risks, planning his next move. He had to be careful. He had to protect her. The man let out a harsh laugh, the sound grating against Russell's nerves. "You think you have a choice?" He took a step towards her, his shadow looming over her small frame. "I do now." Elena's voice was stronger this time, laced with a newfound steel. "I don't want to be saved." Her voice trembled slightly, but the words remained firm. "I just want to be seen." The raw honesty of her words struck Russell with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about rescue, it was about acknowledgement, about being recognized, not as a victim, but as a person. He understood. He'd spent so long hiding in the shadows of his own success, unseen, unheard. He understood the suffocating loneliness of invisibility. The man lunged, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. Russell moved, stepping between them, his body shielding Elena from the man's grasp. He held up his phone, the screen displaying the active 911 call. "The police are on their way," he said, his voice level, devoid of any emotion. He felt a strange calmness descend upon him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was participating. He was making a difference. The man froze, his eyes widening in surprise. He glanced from Russell to Elena, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Russell held his gaze, his expression unwavering. He subtly shifted his position, ensuring the entire scene was captured by the phone's camera. He knew this recording would be crucial evidence. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The man's face paled, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the approaching law. He backed away slowly, his eyes darting nervously towards the alley's entrance. Elena stood behind Russell, her small hand gripping the back of his jacket. He could feel her trembling, but it was different now. It wasn't the tremor of fear, but the aftershock of adrenaline, the residual hum of facing down a demon and emerging victorious. The police cars screeched to a halt at the alley's entrance, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Officers swarmed into the alley, their movements swift and practiced. The man made a half-hearted attempt to flee, but he was quickly apprehended, his protests swallowed by the night. As the officers led the man away, Elena stepped out from behind Russell, her eyes meeting his. The fear had receded, replaced by a fragile but undeniable strength. He saw a flicker of gratitude in her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the shared moment, the unspoken understanding that passed between them. He offered her a small, hesitant smile, a gesture that felt foreign yet strangely natural. He knew he wouldn't forget this night, this girl, this alley. It was a crack in the carefully constructed wall around his heart, a breach that let in the cold, harsh reality of the world, but also, unexpectedly, a sliver of warmth, a glimmer of hope. He had retreated into his world of code, seeking solace in its logic and order. But tonight, in the heart of this grimy alley, he found something he hadn't realized he was missing. A connection, a purpose. The silence of Russell's home was a stark contrast to the cacophony of the city streets. It pressed in on Elena, heavy and unfamiliar. The plush carpet muffled her footsteps. The high ceilings swallowed the sound of her shallow breaths. Everything felt too large, too pristine, like a museum exhibit she was afraid to touch. She clutched the borrowed sweatshirt tighter, the fabric rough against her skin, the only tangible reminder of the chaotic hours that had led her here. Had it only been hours since she sat hunched on that bench, stomach gnawing with hunger, heart pounding with fear? It felt like a lifetime. Russell moved through the space with an easy grace, a quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from the very walls of his home. He offered her a room, a guest suite bathed in soft moonlight filtering through sheer curtains. The bed was impossibly large, piled high with pillows that looked like clouds. She hesitated at the threshold, the luxury foreign and intimidating. "I can sleep on the couch," she mumbled, the words catching in her throat. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, a brief tightening of his lips before a small, almost hesitant smile touched the corners of his mouth. "The couch is quite uncomfortable, Elena. The bed is much better suited for sleeping." His voice was gentle, a soothing balm against the raw edges of her fear. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. The kindness in his gesture was a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. It felt dangerous, this unexpected warmth, this offer of safety. She was accustomed to the harsh sting of indifference, the cold bite of neglect. Kindness, she'd learned, was often a prelude to something worse. The morning light painted the room in soft hues of gold and rose. Elena woke disoriented, the unfamiliar comfort momentarily displacing the gnawing anxiety that had become her constant companion. She sat up, the silken sheets cool against her skin. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply breathe, to exist in the quiet stillness of the room, a luxury she hadn't known in what felt like an eternity. But the respite was short-lived. The reality of her situation crashed down on her with the force of a tidal wave. She was still a runaway, still adrift, still haunted by the shadows of her past. She found Russell in the kitchen, a starkly modern space with stainless steel appliances that gleamed under the pendant lights. He was hunched over a laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. The clicking of the keys was a rhythmic counterpoint to the hum of the refrigerator. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening into a warm smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the quiet space. "Sleep well." She nodded, unable to articulate the complex mix of emotions swirling within her. Gratitude warred with suspicion, hope battled with despair. "I don't know what to do now," she whispered, the words heavy with the weight of her uncertainty. Russell closed his laptop, the sudden silence amplifying the vulnerability in her voice. He studied her for a moment, his gaze intense but not unkind. "You just have to want better, Elena," he said finally, his voice firm but gentle. "That's the first step." His words resonated deep within her, a spark igniting in the darkness. Want better. The concept was so simple, yet so foreign. She'd been so focused on survival, on simply getting through each day, that the idea of wanting something more, of hoping for a different future, had seemed like an impossible dream. But now, looking into Russell's eyes, seeing the genuine concern reflected there, a flicker of that dream began to take hold. He spoke of a place, a youth advocacy center, where she could find support, guidance, a path forward. He described it with a quiet conviction that chipped away at her resistance, at the fear that whispered warnings in her ear. Could she trust him? Could she trust anyone? The questions swirled in her mind, a tempest of doubt and uncertainty. But something in his demeanor, in the steady strength he exuded, compelled her to believe, to take a leap of faith into the unknown. The drive to the center was a blur. Elena stared out the window, the city streets a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, a whirlwind of fear and hope, of trepidation and anticipation. She glanced at Russell, his profile sharp against the backdrop of the city skyline. He seemed so calm, so in control. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. As they pulled up to the center, a wave of panic washed over her. She wanted to bolt, to run back to the familiar streets, to the dangerous comfort of her old life. But Russell's hand on her arm, a gentle but firm pressure, anchored her to the present. "It's okay to be scared, Elena," he said softly, his voice a quiet reassurance against the storm raging within her. "But you don't have to do this alone." He led her inside, the sterile environment a stark contrast to the warmth of his car. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman with a gentle smile, greeted them warmly. As Russell explained the situation, a figure emerged from the hallway. A tall, imposing man with a sneer that twisted his lips into a cruel mockery of a smile. Elena's blood ran cold. It was him, the man who haunted her nightmares, the source of her terror. He strode towards them, his eyes fixed on Elena, a predatory gleam in their depths. "There you are," he snarled, his voice dripping with menace. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Russell stepped forward, placing himself between Elena and her abuser, his body a shield against the threat. The air crackled with tension, the unspoken promise of violence hanging heavy in the air. "She's not going anywhere with you," Russell said, his voice low and dangerous, a steeliness she hadn't heard before. The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze darting between Russell and Elena. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat as two security guards appeared, flanking Russell. The man's bravado crumbled, replaced by a look of fear and resentment. He backed away, muttering threats under his breath, before disappearing back into the hallway. Elena stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, the remnants of fear clinging to her like a shroud. Russell turned to her, his gaze softening as he saw the terror etched on her face. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "It's over now, Elena," he whispered, his voice a soothing balm against the raw wounds of her past. "You're safe now." And in that moment, surrounded by the sterile walls of the advocacy center, Elena knew he was right. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile seed of possibility taking root in the barren landscape of her heart. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she was no longer alone. She had found a safe harbor, a place to begin the long and arduous journey of healing. And for that, she was eternally grateful. The fluorescent lights of the Youth Advocacy Center hummed a sterile tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of Elena's inner world. Russell Camden, a man more accustomed to the quiet hum of servers in his home office, felt oddly out of place amidst the brightly colored posters and worn furniture. He shifted his weight, the expensive leather of his shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor, a sound that seemed to amplify the silence hanging between him and the social worker. He'd expected gratitude, maybe even a touch of awe at his generosity, but Ms. Jensen's gaze held a weary understanding that went beyond pleasantries. "Mr. Camden, your donation is significant. It will make a real difference." He could hear the unspoken words hanging in the air, "more than you know." Russell swallowed, a sudden dryness in his throat. He hadn't anticipated this unfamiliar pang off something. Not quite guilt, but perhaps a recognition of a vast chasm he'd been unknowingly straddling his whole life. Elena sat hunched in a corner, her thin frame swallowed by an oversized sweatshirt. Her eyes, wide and dark, followed Russell with a cautious curiosity, like a startled fawn assessing a potential threat. He met her gaze, a flicker of recognition passing between them. A memory of shared French fries on a cold park bench, a silent understanding forged in the heart of a shared vulnerability. The social worker, sensing the unspoken connection, excused herself, leaving Russell and Elena in a fragile bubble of shared experience. He approached her slowly, unsure of what to say, of how to bridge the distance between their vastly different worlds. "How are you, Elena?" The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He knew her story, the horrific details whispered in hushed tones by the social worker, yet he felt utterly unprepared to face the reality of her pain. "Better," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Than before. She clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted and threadbare, a silent testament to the hardships she'd endured. Russell sat beside her, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken emotions. He thought of the sterile emptiness of his own meticulously organized life, a life devoid of such raw, unfiltered emotion. He'd built walls around himself, brick by brick, to keep the world at bay, to protect himself from the messiness of human connection. Yet here he was, confronted by a girl whose life had been shattered by that very messiness, and he felt inadequate. He felt a strange compulsion to do more, to mend the broken pieces of her world, even if it meant exposing himself to the very chaos he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Later, back in the familiar solitude of his home, Russell found himself drawn to his computer. The sleek lines and cool metal offered a comforting sense of control, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil he'd experienced at the center. He opened a new document, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wasn't a writer, not in the traditional sense. His world was one of code, of logic, of precise algorithms. Yet, the words began to flow, fueled by a newfound urgency, a desire to share Elena's story, to give voice to the voiceless. He wrote about the girl on the bench, about the silent plea in her eyes, about the systemic failures that had allowed her to fall through the cracks. He wrote about the Youth Advocacy Center, about the tireless work they did with limited resources. He wrote about hope, about the power of human connection, about the ripple effect of a single act of kindness. He posted the blog anonymously, unsure of the reception it would receive. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Russell continued to visit Elena at the center, their conversations slowly deepening, the fragile trust between them solidifying. He watched as she began to heal, as the fear in her eyes slowly faded, replaced by a flicker of resilience. He saw her engage in art therapy, her hands finding solace in the vibrant colors and textures, creating worlds of beauty amidst the chaos she'd endured. He listened as she spoke about her dreams, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence a scholarship, a future, a life beyond the shadows of her past. "I didn't think I'd make it this far," she confessed one day, her voice trembling with emotion. Russell simply smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. His blog post had gone viral, sparking a groundswell of support for the Advocacy Center. Donations poured in, allowing them to expand their services, to reach more children like Elena. He'd remained anonymous, his reward not in recognition, but in witnessing the tangible impact of his words. One crisp autumn evening, as Russell sat on his porch, the scent of wood smoke clinging to the air, his phone rang. It was Elena. Her voice was filled with a mixture of fear and urgency. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He found me." The detached observer within Russell shattered. He felt a surge of protective anger, a primal instinct to shield her from harm. He didn't hesitate. He was in his car within minutes, the engine roaring to life, breaking the quiet stillness of the suburban night. He arrived at the center to find a scene of controlled chaos. Police cars flashed their lights, casting long, eerie shadows across the building. He saw Elena huddled with Ms. Jensen, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. And then he saw him, a hulking figure lurking in the shadows, his face contorted in a mask of rage. Russell felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal instinct to protect. He stepped forward, his voice calm and steady, his presence a bulwark against the man's fury. The confrontation was brief, the man's bluster quickly fading in the face of Russell's unwavering resolve and the approaching sirens. As the police led the man away, Russell turned to Elena. She stood there, small and fragile, yet radiating a newfound strength. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw a flicker of hope, a spark of resilience that had been ignited by a shared meal on a park bench, by a blog post written in the dead of night, by a simple act of human connection. Russell stood on the steps of the Advocacy Center, watching the taillights disappear into the night. The cool night air brushed against his face, carrying the faint scent of rain. He thought of Elena, safe inside, and a profound sense of peace settled over him. He realized that he hadn't just saved her, she had, in a way, saved him. She had shown him the power of connection, the profound impact of a single act of kindness. He had built his empire on lines of code, on algorithms and logic, but it was in the messy, unpredictable realm of human emotion that he had finally found his purpose. The ripple effect, he thought, the power of one small act to change the course of a life, to touch countless others, to create waves of change in a world desperately in need of connection.